Next, for reviews, guys, we are talking Buffy, #1, Boom Studios. This is the second Boom Studios book that we've done in as many weeks. We talked, I think it was actually 3 weeks ago. I need to write these things down. We talked about the Firefly. Yeah, it was last week. Firefly #2 is what we talked about, because we didn't talk about #1, because I wasn't 100% sure of how I felt in #1. I wanted to give it another book before we talked about it on the Week in Nerddom. So, this is #1. I felt like it was important to hit the #1 for this series because I may or may not have continued reading it. I was a passive fan of the series when it was airing. When it was on Netflix, again, more recently, it's not there now, but it was about a year ago. Me and my girlfriend watched every episode again, and it holds up pretty well in spite of, the technology issues and whatever, but still, story-wise, it's still engrossing, still, definitely solid Joss Whedon writing and directing. So I felt like it was important to catch #1 on here because I may or may not have continued reading it. After having picked up book #1, I feel like I'll give it a few books before I make the decision to stop reading it. So we'll make it at least to #5 before I decide yay or nay. We're not going to talk about everyone on the channel, but we will, if things go drastically one way or the other, we'll definitely talk about it then. But how is this one before we get into Beyond? This one was the first time I read through it, it kind of gave me a lot of hope for the series. It was solid, and I need to clue you guys in. When I first read a comic book, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to each page. I just thumb through and get a feel for the book. I read some of the dialogue, I look at the action, I look at the art, the kind of some of the framing, some of the layouts, and that kind of stuff. Just a real quick kind of breeze through. And then on second reading, that's when I get into the details. And on the broad strokes, this is almost as brilliant, if not as brilliant, as the Firefly book that we talked about last week. But then you get in a little bit deeper, and it starts to lose some of its shininess. And let's get into the other camera angle, and I'll explain a little better. So, first, the first thing, and I noticed this when the book was announced and we talked about it and we were looking at this artwork to begin with, the head proportion is just a little bit off, and it's normally not something I really care all that much about, but it's just enough that it's like, yeah, her head's just a little too big for her body. It doesn't look natural. So first page, right off the bat, we already see some of the things that have changed. And on this page, I can show you one thing I have a little bit of an issue with, and one thing I think is kind of funny and an interesting but not a negative change to the story. The interesting but not negative change to the story is Buffy's job. Tooniverse. I don't remember, again, it's been almost a year since I watched the show last, and I was kind of only passively watching it most of the time, so my memory might not be the greatest of the series, but I don't remember Buffy having a job that we ever spent any time in. Like, yeah, I'm pretty sure she had a job once or twice, aside from the magic shop in the later seasons that Giles owned after she graduated high school, but other than that, she never had a boring fast food job, and especially not one that we saw in the series. So that is an interesting change. Kind of adds a new layer to the character that I think is not negative and potentially not necessarily positive, just interesting. And then the thing that I have issue with are these bubbles, the narration bubbles. If you look at them, it's kind of Doogie Howser-ish in that it looks like it's her typing a journal. And we're going to see later that it is kind of sort of her typing a journal, but we'll get there when we get there. But it just doesn't feel The dialogue feels like somebody trying a little too hard to mimic Joss Whedon dialogue. It's a monologue, I guess, is technically, because she's talking to herself. At first, it was like, oh, that's kind of clever. Some of the vocabulary in those boxes is like, oh, that's kind of clever. But then again, you go back through and pay a little bit more attention to it. It's like, oh, she watched the show, but now she's more just trying to mimic and not. Yeah, it just feels a little stilted, I guess, is the best way to put it. As far as the layouts go, this feels like, and maybe this is intentional and maybe it's not, but it feels like the early CW, or at the time when this aired, WB television. Like there's not a whole lot of interesting camera movement. We get this close up on his mouth for some reason that doesn't. Kind of boring. There's nothing, like, even from the Naomi layouts, there was some interesting stuff that they did with the framing. Nothing really, really stands out as far as the framing here. And then we get into one of our first mythology issues. Buffy is a very popular franchise. Buffy has the strong potential to run for a long time. There is absolutely no reason for her to blow her cover in the first issue of the book. That is unnecessary. Yes, I understand that Xander and Willow are going to play a pretty major part in the future, but in the series, it took some time for her to show off, to let them into her world. It was quite a few episodes in. It wasn't the first freaking episode, so that kind of stuck out to me a little bit. If we were 5 issues in, everything that happens in this scene would be fantastic, because that's about where you would expect her to have made friends with these two and then blow her cover. This happening in the first issue, even though this art is great. It feels like you're watching an anime version of Buffy. The dialogue in this scene specifically is some of the better dialogue in the entire book, but it's just happening way too soon. Way too soon. So yeah, that and the art and the quasi-similarity to the actors who played them in the series, all of that is really cool. I really dig that. Oh, and then the next issue, that doesn't look like a real comic book. That just looks like awkward children's drawings. This is the next big issue. This is the not the awkward children's drawing. This is the next big issue. So she's in a graveyard, on a grave that we can assume was just buried that day. There's no reason not to. We get more of these really annoying monologue bubbles, more of the exposition, more of her talking to herself or writing her journal. And then we see hands come and lift the lid, presumably, of this. Now, this is a brand new vampire, because he just came out of his grave. And somehow, he has this little amulet that keeps him alive. And he's heard about this, or he knows who the Slayer is, and knows a witch who's keeping him alive, and that just doesn't make any sense. He's a fresh vampire. Did he get turned on purpose? From my remembrance of the series, that's not a thing that a lot of vampires do, because the human wants to turn. They only turn humans to be cruel, not because it's what the human wants. Really standard, nothing again special about these layouts. And we get to Anya, who I'm fairly sure was actually in the book, or in the series, or in the TV series. My memories of the villains of that series that weren't Spike or Drusilla or Angel at times, or the Master in the first, 2 or 3 seasons, is kind of shaky. So I can't remember specifically because it kind of sounded familiar, maybe a little bit. But so we meet her, we see that she's ruthless because she kills this guy. He's a fresh vampire. What does she care? Like, none of that scene makes sense. There's no reason for that to have happened that way. There's a better way for us to learn about this amulet. And then so she tells Giles about the amulet, and Giles sends her off to class. And then this is the next one. The dialogue, again, in this scene, like, it feels like, who's the writer? Jordie Bellaire. It feels like she got some of the dialogue, not necessarily most. She got some of the dialogue really, really well. She got the rest of the dialogue is just hard to read. So this is where we see Xander in this whole scene is on this computer. This whole scene, we could see the light from the screen right here lighting up their faces. It's in his lap. So there's no reason for us to assume that this wouldn't be the computer screen. Like, it potentially is her phone screen, but that doesn't make sense because she's not on her phone in the rest of these panels. So we get her computer screen that's in Xander's lap, but it's her thoughts that are on this screen. So Xander's reading her journal. It's so weird. It's so weird. And then the last page, we get a reveal for a vampire. Oh, and one little Easter egg that I thought was pretty cool. Anya, I'm presuming that's Anya. We don't know for certain, but we do know for certain because this vampire lady uses her name in the next page that I'm not going to show you. But she's watching as she's taking care of this store after hours for reasons. She's watching Serenity or Firefly or whatever, but that's obviously the Serenity that's on her screen. So pretty cool little Easter egg. We don't learn this vampire lady's name. There is never a time in this book because on the last page she just says, "I'll take what I want, Anya," and that's the end of it. We get to see her as a vampire, like looking like the vampires did from the series, but not. There's a lot of greatness about this book, but there's a lot of bad as well. So, general score for Buffy #1 from Boom Studios is, I went a little harsh, 65 out of 100, because of all of the reasons we've already gone over. It could have been better on so many levels, from almost everything. Like the little bit of action that we got was well drawn, was well framed. Everything else though felt like it was subpar. So 65 of 100. I really wanted to give it a higher score than that, but there was too much clunkiness in this issue. Mythology score for issue #1 is a 79 out of 100. I recognize that this is setting up a new mythology. Jordie Bellaire, I'm sorry if I pronounced it Jodie before, Jordie Bellaire, this is her take. This is an original with existing characters. This is a different story. This is a different origin. So you have to take that in consideration. I tried to set aside my bias for this particular score, but there still is inconsistencies, like the freaking brand new vampire already having the medallion. So yeah, mythology is a 79 out of 100. Story, in the broad strokes, was really good. In the details, was a little less good. But story, I feel like this is a good setup, again, for her new mythology. So, the couple of minor tweaks that I had, the change the journal thing, why is it in Xander's hands? really didn't work against it as much on the story level. Overall, the story actually is very compelling. So we're going for an 85 out of 100 on story. And then the completely subjective enjoyability. In spite of its flaws, in spite of, at times, it feeling like the dialogue was written by somebody who just wants to be Joss in not a good way. Like the Serenity book that we read, Firefly book rather, that we read last week, that one was somebody imitating Joss well. This one, we got 2 scenes of somebody imitating Joss well, and the rest of the book is a poor substitute. But in spite of that, you still get a great feeling about these characters. It's still, even with the logic issues, there's still a whole lot to enjoy about this book. There's plenty to enjoy about this book. So we're going with a 92 out of 100 for the enjoyability on Buffy. I feel like that was a little overly generous, again, considering it's a number 1. 92 is probably one of the highest scores I'll give a number 1 for enjoyability, but it's because there wasn't too much exposition. It was just the way the exposition was given to us could have been better is all. But before we do any of this stuff, before we click that box or go to that website or whatever, guys, always remember that if it's generally nerdy, it's probably here.